Standing in the executive office of Skyway Airlines, my badge trembled in my hand after 16 years as their head flight operations coordinator. The owner's son, Brad, had just fired me to make room for his fiancée Madison, who does ops now. As I warned him, he had 10 minutes before the entire network collapsed without my intricate routing system knowledge. I watched his smug expression. What Brad didn't know was that I had built every failsafe, every backup protocol, every emergency override into the system, and I was the only one who knew how to stop what was about to unfold. My name is Alpha, and as I walked through those familiar hallways for what I thought would be the last time, memories flooded back of my incredible journey from junior coordinator to the mastermind behind Skyway's entire flight operations network. I had started here straight out of college, eager and determined to prove myself in an industry dominated by men who often questioned whether a young woman could handle the complexities of airline operations. Those early years were brutal. I worked 18-hour days, memorizing aircraft specifications, studying weather patterns, and learning every nuance of Federal Aviation Administration regulations. While my male colleagues went home to dinner with their families, I stayed late perfecting routing algorithms that could save the company thousands of dollars in fuel costs. I created weather contingency protocols that anticipated storm patterns weeks in advance. I established crew scheduling matrices that balanced federal rest requirements with operational efficiency, keeping 57 aircraft flying daily across 34 cities. The breakthrough came during my 5th year, when a massive snowstorm hit the Northeast Corridor. The previous operations manager had panicked, grounding flights unnecessarily and costing the company nearly $2 million in lost revenue. I had quietly developed an alternative routing system that could thread flights through weather gaps with surgical precision. When I presented my solution to management, they initially dismissed it as too complex. But when my system successfully rerouted 43 flights around the storm while competitors canceled everything, suddenly everyone wanted to know how Alpha had pulled off the impossible. From that moment, I became indispensable. I designed the backup systems that kept us operational during equipment failures. I negotiated with air traffic control to secure preferred routing slots that gave us competitive advantages. I built relationships with ground crews, gate agents, and maintenance staff that turned our operation into a finely tuned orchestra. Every decision, every protocol, every emergency procedure bore my fingerprints. As I reached my office to pack my personal belongings, I encountered Sarah from Air Traffic Coordination hurrying toward me with panic written across her face. Sarah had been my closest ally for 8 years, a brilliant woman who understood the delicate balance required to keep aircraft moving safely through increasingly crowded airspace. Alpha. Thank goodness you're still here, Sarah gasped, clutching a tablet displaying real-time flight information. Madison already started reorganizing the flight schedules using some basic software program she downloaded from the internet. She's completely ignored the gate assignment protocols you spent 3 years perfecting. My heart sank as Sarah showed me the disaster unfolding in real time. 3 critical flights departing in 6 hours had been double booked for the same gates. Flight 847 to Denver, Flight 203 to Seattle, and Flight 419 to Phoenix were all scheduled to use Gate 12 simultaneously at 3:15 this afternoon. The ground crew supervisor, Tom Rodriguez, had tried to warn Madison about the conflict, but she had dismissed him with condescending remarks about old-fashioned thinking and outdated procedures. She actually told Tom that modern software could handle multiple aircraft at one gate. Sarah whispered incredulously. When he tried to explain the physical impossibility, she accused him of being resistant to innovation and sent him home without pay. I stared at the screen, watching the cascading failures that Madison's ignorance had already set in motion. The fuel delivery trucks were scheduled to service aircraft that wouldn't exist at their assigned positions. Catering services had been notified to stock flights that were now impossible to board. Ground power units were allocated to gates that would be occupied by different aircraft entirely. But the real catastrophe lurked deeper in the system. Madison had somehow gained access to my carefully constructed backup protocols and was systematically dismantling them under the assumption they were redundant legacy code. She had deleted the alternative gate assignments I had programmed for exactly this type of conflict. She had removed the automatic crew notification systems that would have alerted pilots to schedule changes. Most devastating of all, she had deactivated the weather monitoring integration that automatically adjusted operations based on atmospheric conditions. Tom's been calling the emergency supervisors, but nobody wants to override the boss fiancé, Sarah continued. The pilots are starting to arrive for their briefings, and they have no idea their flights don't actually exist anymore. Standing there, surrounded by 16 years of my professional life packed into cardboard boxes, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. Brad wanted to learn about operations management the hard way. Madison thought she could replace institutional knowledge with downloaded software. They had both made their choices, and now they would face the consequences of those decisions. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the mounting missed calls from various department heads who were beginning to realize the scope of the crisis. Maintenance scheduling, fuel coordination, passenger services, security checkpoints, and baggage handling were all trying to reconcile Madison's impossible flight schedule with physical reality. But I let each call go to voicemail as I walked toward the elevator, carrying my boxes toward what I thought would be the end of my career. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 16 years of preventing disasters, I was finally going to watch one unfold in real time. And there was absolutely nothing Brad could do to stop it without admitting he had made the biggest mistake in Skyway Airlines' 23-year history. 2 hours after I had driven away from Skyway Airlines headquarters, I was sitting in my kitchen, sipping coffee, and watching the local news when the first reports began flooding in. The anchor's concerned expression immediately caught my attention as she announced breaking news from Denver International Airport. We're receiving multiple reports of significant delays and passenger confusion at Skyway Airlines Operations Center, she stated, her voice carrying that tone reserved for developing crises. Our aviation correspondent is standing by with live coverage of what appears to be a major scheduling breakdown affecting dozens of flights. I reached for the remote and turned up the volume, feeling my stomach tighten with a mixture of vindication and genuine concern for the passengers caught in Madison's incompetence. The camera switched to the airport, where I could see the familiar blue and silver Skyway aircraft scattered across the tarmac in positions that made no operational sense. The correspondent's voice crackled through my speakers as she described the scene unfolding behind her. Flight 847 to Denver and Flight 203 to Seattle have both arrived at Gate 12 simultaneously, creating unprecedented confusion as ground crews attempt to service both aircraft in the same physical space. Passengers are being directed between gates as airline staff struggle to manage the conflicting schedules. Through the live footage, I could see exactly what I had predicted. 2 Boeing 737s sat nose to tail at the same jetway, their ground crews shouting at each other while passengers pressed against the terminal windows, recording the chaos on their phones. The gate agent, a young woman named Jennifer, whom I had trained personally, looked completely overwhelmed as she tried to manage boarding procedures for 2 flights that couldn't physically occur. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. It's worse than we thought. Madison just called the tower and tried to authorize simultaneous pushbacks from the same gate. Air traffic control thinks we've lost our minds. The situation escalated rapidly as social media amplified the confusion. Twitter feeds filled with passenger complaints. Instagram stories showed the gate area packed with frustrated travelers, and Facebook posts tagged Skyway Airlines with increasingly angry commentary. The hashtag Skyway Chaos began trending as passengers documented their experiences with delayed flights, contradictory announcements, and staff members who clearly had no idea what was happening. But the real crisis emerged when the news anchor's expression shifted to genuine alarm. We're now receiving reports that a medical emergency flight carrying a heart transplant patient has been unable to land due to the gate availability crisis. The patient's family is here at the airport, and well go live to our correspondent for their statement. My coffee mug froze halfway to my lips as the camera focused on a desperate family standing in the terminal's main concourse. An elderly man with tears in his eyes clutched the hand of a woman who was clearly his wife, while their adult daughter spoke directly to the news crew. "My father has been waiting 18 months for this heart," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "The donor heart is on Flight 912 from Chicago, and they're telling us there's no available gate for the aircraft to park. Every minute that passes reduces the viability of the organ. My father could die because of their scheduling mistakes." The camera panned to show the aircraft circling overhead, burning precious fuel while Madison's gate allocation disaster prevented the life-saving landing. I watched Flight 912's tracking information on my tablet, knowing that the pilots were probably running through emergency protocols to find alternative airports, while the transplant team calculated how much time remained before the organ became unusable. My personal phone started ringing incessantly. The caller ID showed Brad's number, then the main operations line, then Brad again. I let each call go to voicemail while I walked outside to tend my garden, needing the physical activity to process the magnitude of the unfolding disaster. The peaceful routine of watering my tomatoes and checking my herb garden provided a stark contrast to the chaos erupting at the airport just 12 miles away. As I adjusted the sprinkler system I had installed last summer, my mind automatically cataloged the operational procedures that Madison should have followed to prevent this catastrophe. Gate assignments required a minimum 45-minute buffer between aircraft arrivals to accommodate deplaning, cleaning, restocking, and reboarding procedures. Medical emergency flights held priority status that superseded all other scheduling considerations. Weather contingency protocols mandated maintaining at least 2 unassigned gates for unexpected diversions or operational flexibility. Madison had violated every single principle of safe airport operations in less than 4 hours on the job. My tablet chimed with weather alerts that would have normally triggered automatic protocol adjustments throughout the Skyway network. Thunderstorms were building southwest of Denver, requiring the precise coordination systems I had spent years developing. The storms would demand immediate rerouting of 6 flights, adjustment of fuel loads for increased holding patterns, and coordination with air traffic control for alternative approach vectors. But Madison couldn't locate the weather protocol files because she had dismissed them as unnecessary complications during her earlier system review. The sophisticated algorithms I had built to predict storm movements and adjust operations accordingly were now inactive, leaving the entire network vulnerable to nature's unpredictability. As evening fell and the news coverage continued, I realized that this was only the beginning. Madison's changes would create ripple effects throughout the system for days, possibly weeks. Every canceled flight would displace passengers onto future flights that were already fully booked. Every delayed aircraft would miss its next scheduled departure, creating a domino effect that would cascade across the entire network. Brad had wanted to replace expertise with enthusiasm. Now he was about to learn the difference between confidence and competence. And the lesson was going to cost his family's airline everything they had built over more than 2 decades. By the second day, I was monitoring the situation from my home office, while Skyway's entire operation teetered on the brink of complete collapse. The overnight reports painted a picture of systematic failure that exceeded even my pessimistic predictions. Madison's inexperience had created a domino effect that was spreading across the entire network like a virus attacking the airline's central nervous system. The morning news brought footage of stranded passengers sleeping in terminal chairs, their flights canceled indefinitely, as Madison struggled to understand the basic principles of aircraft rotation and crew scheduling. What she didn't grasp was that each aircraft had to complete a specific sequence of flights throughout the day, with each leg depending on the successful completion of the previous one. When she disrupted the morning departures, she had inadvertently sabotaged every subsequent flight in the chain. My former colleague Janet from crew scheduling called me in tears, her voice barely audible over the background noise of what sounded like complete chaos in the operations center. "Alpha, it's a nightmare here. Madison accidentally activated the winter storm protocols during perfectly clear weather, and now half our fleet is grounded unnecessarily," She found the emergency weather button in your old system and pressed it thinking it would solve the gate conflicts. I closed my eyes, visualizing the cascading failures that single mistake would trigger. The winter storm protocols I had designed were meant to preemptively position aircraft at protected gates during severe weather events, reducing the number of available parking positions to ensure passenger safety during ice storms and blizzards. Activating those protocols during clear weather had effectively cut the airport's capacity in half for no reason whatsoever. She's telling everyone that you sabotaged the system before you left, Janet continued. But we all know that's impossible. The protocols are working exactly as designed. She just doesn't understand what any of them actually do. Throughout the morning, I received a series of secret phone calls from flight captains, ground supervisors, and crew schedulers who were desperately trying to maintain some semblance of safe operations despite Madison's increasingly erratic decisions. Captain Rodriguez from the Pilots Union called to inform me that Madison had been lying to Brad about having everything under control while simultaneously begging the flight crews to just figure it out without providing any coherent guidance. She's been telling Brad that the delays are due to air traffic control and weather, but we all know the truth, Captain Rodriguez explained. Yesterday, she tried to send Flight 426 to Atlanta with only half the required fuel because she misread the distance calculations. Our pilots are refusing to accept flight plans that don't meet safety standards, but she's threatening disciplinary action for insubordination. The most disturbing news came from my contact in the fuel management department. Madison had attempted to override the automated fuel calculation systems that I had integrated with weight and balance requirements, weather considerations, and alternate airport designations. Her modifications had nearly created a situation where an aircraft would have departed with insufficient fuel to reach its destination safely, a violation that could trigger immediate Federal Aviation Administration investigation and potential criminal charges. As the second day progressed, my industry connections began feeding me intelligence about how Skyway's competitors were responding to the crisis. United Airlines had quietly increased their flight frequency on Skyway's most profitable routes, offering stranded passengers immediate alternative bookings. Southwest was running targeted social media campaigns, highlighting their operational reliability. Delta had dispatched customer service teams to airports where Skyway passengers were stranded, offering discounted tickets and collecting valuable customer data in the process. The financial implications were staggering. Each canceled flight represented approximately $50,000 in lost revenue, not including the compensation costs for displaced passengers, hotel accommodations for stranded travelers, and the immeasurable damage to Skyway's reputation. Industry analysts were already speculating about the airline's long-term viability if the operational chaos continued beyond the current week. But the crisis deepened further when I received an unexpected call from Marcus Thompson, a senior executive at the Aviation Insurance Consortium that provided liability coverage for Skyway's operations. His voice carried the weight of someone delivering potentially devastating news. Alpha, we need to talk confidentially about the safety violations occurring under the new management structure, Marcus said carefully. Our risk assessment team has been monitoring the situation, and we're concerned that the current operational irregularities could void certain aspects of Skyway's coverage. If there's an incident related to fuel miscalculations or improper crew scheduling, we might not be able to honor the policy claims. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Without insurance coverage, Skyway couldn't legally operate commercial flights. The threat of policy cancellation would force the airline into immediate bankruptcy if the insurance company decided the safety risks had become unacceptable. Madison's incompetence wasn't just creating operational problems, it was threatening the airline's legal right to exist. As I sat in my home office that evening, surrounded by the aviation industry publications and technical manuals that had guided my career, I realized I was witnessing something unprecedented. I had seen airlines struggle with mechanical problems, weather delays, and economic downturns. But I had never watched an airline destroy itself through pure incompetence in such a short time frame. The irony was profound. For 16 years, I had dedicated my expertise to preventing exactly this type of crisis. I had built systems designed to protect against human error, created protocols that maintained safety even when individuals made mistakes, and established redundancies that could compensate for inexperience or poor judgment. Madison had managed to circumvent every safeguard I had carefully constructed, not through malicious intent but through sheer ignorance of how complex systems actually function. She had treated airline operations like a simple scheduling problem that could be solved with basic software, completely missing the intricate web of regulations, safety requirements, and operational interdependencies that governed every aspect of commercial aviation. My phone rang again, displaying Brad's number for the 20th time that day. But instead of letting it go to voicemail, this time I answered, "Alpha, thank God." Brad's voice was strained with desperation. "We need you back immediately. Name your price. Whatever it takes." "I'm sorry, Brad," I replied calmly. "But Madison assured you she could handle operations." "I'm sure she'll figure it out eventually." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, broken only by the sound of airport chaos in the background. When Brad finally spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Alpha, please. The board is asking questions I can't answer. The insurance company is threatening to cancel our coverage. We need your help." "I'm sure Madison can handle it," I repeated, and then I hung up. The time had come to discover exactly how much my expertise was truly worth. On the third day of the crisis, my investigation into Madison's background and qualifications took an unexpected and shocking turn that transformed my understanding of the entire situation. What I had initially attributed to incompetence and nepotism was actually something far more sinister and calculated. My curiosity had been triggered by Madison's complete lack of even basic aviation knowledge. While inexperience could explain operational mistakes, her decisions seemed almost deliberately destructive. She wasn't just making errors. She was systematically dismantling the most critical components of Skyway's operational infrastructure with surgical precision. Using my still active security credentials, which the company had forgotten to deactivate in the chaos of my hasty departure, I accessed the corporate communication logs through the remote system I had helped design. What I discovered in those digital files changed everything I thought I knew about Madison's hiring and her relationship with Brad. The email trail painted a picture of calculated deception that spanned nearly 8 months. Madison's romantic pursuit of Brad hadn't been coincidental. It had been a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to gain access to Skyway's operational secrets. The earliest messages I found were communications between Madison and executives at Continental Express, Skyway's largest regional competitor. Continental's Director of Strategic Acquisitions, Robert Chen, had outlined a detailed plan to acquire Skyway through a combination of financial pressure and operational sabotage. The correspondence revealed that Continental had been secretly purchasing Skyway's outstanding debt from various creditors, positioning themselves to force a bankruptcy acquisition if the airline's financial position deteriorated sufficiently. Madison's role in this scheme was specifically designed to accelerate that financial deterioration by creating operational chaos that would drive away customers, trigger regulatory investigations, and ultimately force the company into insolvency. The emails showed Continental promising Madison a senior executive position in their expanded operations division once the acquisition was complete. The most chilling discovery was an email thread discussing me specifically. Continental's research had identified my expertise as the primary obstacle to their acquisition strategy. As long as I remained at Skyway, my operational knowledge and crisis management skills could potentially save the airline from any sabotage efforts. Madison's instructions were explicit: find a way to remove Alpha from the organization without raising suspicions about ulterior motives. Her romantic manipulation of Brad had been the perfect cover for accomplishing this objective. By convincing him that she was qualified to replace me, Madison had simultaneously eliminated Continental's biggest threat while positioning herself to maximize the damage to Skyway's operations. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Madison had photographed confidential route maps, copied passenger demographic data, and transmitted supplier contract information to Continental's executives. She had provided detailed intelligence about Skyway's most profitable routes, their pricing strategies, and their expansion plans for the following year. But the most damning evidence came from a recorded phone conversation between Madison and Continental's CEO, discussing the timeline for Skyway's anticipated collapse. They projected that the operational chaos would force bankruptcy within 30 days, allowing Continental to acquire Skyway's routes, gates, and aircraft at a fraction of their actual value. The personal betrayal cut deeper than the professional sabotage. Madison had deliberately targeted my removal because my expertise threatened their entire scheme. Every late night I had spent perfecting operational protocols, every crisis I had successfully managed, every innovation I had implemented to improve safety and efficiency had made me Continental's primary enemy. As I compiled the evidence, cross-referencing emails with financial records and operational decisions, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Continental had been planning this acquisition for over 2 years, methodically identifying vulnerabilities in Skyway's business model and positioning themselves to exploit those weaknesses. The scheme required Madison to maintain her sabotage role until Skyway's financial position became untenable, at which point Continental would offer a rescue acquisition that would preserve jobs while eliminating a competitor. The employees would be grateful for Continental's intervention, never knowing they had engineered the crisis that necessitated their salvation. But Continental had made one critical miscalculation. They had underestimated both the complexity of airline operations and my unwillingness to quietly accept professional destruction. Their plan depended on Madison's ability to manage the operational breakdown in a way that appeared accidental rather than deliberate. Instead, her complete incompetence had created such obvious chaos that industry observers were beginning to question whether external factors might be involved. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Madison just tried to authorize fuel loading procedures that violate federal safety regulations. Captain Williams filed a formal safety complaint with the FAA. This is getting serious. The Federal Aviation Administration involvement changed everything. Once federal investigators began examining Skyway's operational records, they would inevitably discover the evidence of systematic sabotage. Continental's scheme required subtlety and plausible deniability, but Madison's incompetence had created such blatant violations that regulatory scrutiny was now inevitable. I realized I held the power to expose the entire conspiracy, but I needed to act carefully to avoid legal retaliation from Continental's team of corporate attorneys. The evidence was solid, but I needed to present it in a way that would protect both Skyway and myself from potential lawsuits or criminal accusations. As evening approached, I made the decision that would determine the fate of both airlines. I began drafting a comprehensive report documenting every aspect of Continental's acquisition scheme, complete with email transcripts, financial records, and operational evidence. But instead of immediately releasing the information, I decided to use it as leverage to restructure the entire situation to my advantage. Continental thought they were acquiring a vulnerable airline through corporate espionage. Instead, they were about to discover that they had declared war on someone who understood their business better than they understood it themselves. Madison's phone records showed increasing desperation in her communications with Continental's executives. They were pressuring her to accelerate the timeline, demanding that she create conditions for bankruptcy within 2 weeks rather than 30 days. The pressure was causing her to make increasingly reckless decisions that were creating a paper trail of intentional sabotage. I smiled as I realized that Continental's impatience would become their downfall. In their eagerness to acquire Skyway quickly, they were forcing Madison to abandon the subtlety that had protected their scheme. Soon, her actions would be so obviously destructive that even Brad would be forced to acknowledge the truth. The game was far from over. But for the first time since walking out of that executive office, I felt like I was holding the winning cards. Armed with irrefutable evidence of Continental Express corporate espionage scheme, I began implementing a calculated counterattack that would restore my reputation while simultaneously destroying their acquisition plans. My 16 years of experience in airline operations had taught me that timing and precision were essential for navigating complex challenges, and I applied those same principles to orchestrating Continental's downfall. My first move was to anonymously contact investigative aviation reporters who specialized in exposing corporate malfeasance within the airline industry. Rachel Martinez from Aviation Weekly had built her career on uncovering safety violations and regulatory corruption, making her the perfect conduit for releasing selected portions of the evidence I had gathered. Rather than overwhelming Rachel with the complete conspiracy details, I provided her with just enough information to begin her own investigation. I leaked Madison's safety violation attempts, her unauthorized access to confidential systems, and her complete lack of aviation qualifications. The story I crafted positioned Madison as an unqualified individual who had somehow gained operational control through personal relationships rather than professional competence. Within 24 hours, Rachel's preliminary article appeared online with the headline, "Nepotism or Negligence? How Skyway Airlines Operations Collapsed Under Unqualified Management." The piece didn't mention Continental Express or corporate espionage, but it established the foundation for the larger story that would eventually emerge. Simultaneously, I began reaching out to Skyway's major investors and board members, offering my services as an independent consultant to assess the operational crisis and provide recommendations for recovery. My approach was carefully crafted to appear helpful rather than vindictive, positioning myself as a concerned industry professional rather than a disgruntled former employee. Board member Patricia Williams, a retired airline executive who had always respected my expertise, agreed to meet with me privately to discuss the situation. During our 2-hour conversation at her downtown office, I provided her with detailed technical analysis showing how Madison's operational failures had cost the company over $8 million in just 4 days. "Patricia, the fundamental issue isn't just incompetence," I explained, spreading operational charts across her conference table. "These aren't random mistakes. Look at the pattern of decisions. Every change Madison made systematically eliminated the safeguards that protected Skyway's most valuable operational assets." Patricia studied the documentation with the keen eye of someone who had spent 30 years in airline management. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as she recognized the implications of the evidence I was presenting. The gate allocation disasters, the fuel calculation errors, the crew scheduling violations. I continued. Each of these mistakes specifically targeted the systems that gave Skyway competitive advantages over Continental Express. These aren't the errors someone makes through inexperience. These are the changes someone makes when they understand exactly which systems to attack. I watched Patricia's face as the implications sank in. She began asking pointed questions about Madison's background, her qualifications, and her relationship with Brad. I provided honest answers while carefully avoiding direct accusations that could expose my investigation methods. Within hours of our meeting, Patricia had arranged private conversations with 3 other board members. By the end of the week, I had presented my operational assessment to a majority of Skyway's board of directors, each of whom left our meetings with serious concerns about the company's current leadership structure. My next strategic move involved reaching out to disgruntled Skyway employees who had been directly impacted by Madison's operational changes. Rather than organizing these contacts myself, I worked through Sarah and other trusted colleagues who could arrange informal meetings without creating evidence of my involvement. The employee testimonials were devastating. Ground Crew Supervisor Tom Rodriguez documented how Madison had dismissed safety protocols that prevented aircraft collision during pushback procedures. Flight dispatcher Maria Santos described Madison's attempts to override federal regulations governing pilot rest requirements. Gate agent Jennifer Walsh provided recordings of Madison's instructions to ignore passenger safety briefings during boarding procedures. Each conversation was carefully documented, not as evidence for potential litigation but as testimony for industry regulators who were beginning their own investigation into Skyway's operational irregularities. The employees weren't just complaining about management changes. They were reporting specific safety violations that threatened passenger lives. My masterstroke came when I approached Skyway's insurance consortium with evidence that the safety violations under Madison's management could void their liability coverage. I presented this information not as a threat but as a concerned industry professional who wanted to protect the insurance company from potentially catastrophic claims. Insurance executive Marcus Thompson invited me to their headquarters for a comprehensive presentation about the operational risks Skyway now presented. I documented each safety violation, explained the potential consequences of continued operational irregularities, and provided technical analysis showing how Madison's changes had eliminated the safety margins that justified Skyway's current insurance rates. Marcus, I'm not trying to cause problems for anyone, I explained during our meeting, but as someone who spent 16 years building safety systems at Skyway, I have an ethical obligation to ensure that insurance coverage expectations align with actual operational realities. The insurance company's response was swift and decisive. They issued a formal notice to Skyway's board, requiring immediate operational improvements or face policy cancellation within 30 days. The notice specifically cited safety violations that had occurred under Madison's management, creating legal documentation that would be difficult for Continental Express to explain away during their eventual acquisition attempt. As pressure mounted from multiple directions, I received reports that major Skyway clients were threatening to cancel their corporate travel contracts. The operational chaos had disrupted business travel schedules, cost companies thousands of dollars in employee productivity, and damaged relationships with important customers who relied on predictable air service. 3 of Skyway's largest corporate clients had already begun shifting their travel contracts to competitors, representing nearly $2 million in annual revenue. Hotel chains that had partnered with Skyway for package vacation deals were questioning their agreements, worried that continued operational problems would damage their own customer satisfaction ratings. The cumulative financial pressure was exactly what I had anticipated. Board members were receiving daily reports about mounting losses, regulatory scrutiny, insurance threats, and customer defections. The crisis had escalated beyond operational problems to threaten the airline's fundamental viability. Through my industry connections, I learned that Continental Express executives were becoming increasingly frustrated with Madison's performance. Their scheme required controlled deterioration that would justify their acquisition offer while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. Instead, Madison's incompetence had created such obvious chaos that federal investigators were beginning to examine Skyway's records for evidence of systematic sabotage. Continental's CEO, David Park, had reportedly demanded an emergency meeting with Madison to discuss accelerating their timeline. The pressure to complete the acquisition quickly was forcing them to abandon the careful planning that had protected their scheme, creating vulnerabilities that I was prepared to exploit. My phone buzzed with an urgent message from Patricia Williams. Emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. We need your expertise to understand our options. Can you attend as an external consultant? I smiled as I typed my response, confirming my availability. After 4 days of careful maneuvering, all the pieces were finally positioning themselves for the final confrontation. Continental Express had underestimated both the complexity of their target and the determination of their primary obstacle. Tomorrow, I would walk back into Skyway Airlines headquarters, not as a dismissed employee seeking reinstatement, but as the industry expert who held the power to save or destroy everyone involved in this conspiracy. The emergency board meeting convened at 8 o'clock on Friday morning in Skyway's executive conference room, the same space where I had been unceremoniously dismissed just 1 week earlier. The atmosphere was tense and desperate as board members filed in, their faces reflecting the gravity of the crisis that threatened to destroy their 23-year-old airline. I arrived not as a former employee seeking vindication, but as an independent aviation consultant hired by the board's legal team to assess operational irregularities and provide expert testimony for potential regulatory proceedings. My comprehensive report documented every aspect of the week's disasters while carefully building the foundation for exposing Continental Express corporate espionage scheme. Patricia Williams called the meeting to order while Brad sat at the far end of the table, his usual confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone who had watched his inheritance crumble in real time. Madison occupied the chair beside him, her nervous energy barely contained as she clutched a folder of printouts that supposedly contained solutions to the operational crisis. "Ladies and gentlemen, we face an unprecedented situation," Patricia began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated multiple industry downturns. "In 7 days, our operational performance has deteriorated to levels that threaten our insurance coverage, our regulatory compliance, and our fundamental ability to serve passengers safely." She gestured toward me as I opened my presentation materials. "We've engaged Alpha as an external consultant to provide technical analysis of our current situation and recommendations for immediate corrective action." I stood and activated the conference room's projection system, displaying the first slide of my carefully prepared presentation. The title read simply, "Operational Assessment and Recovery Recommendations for Skyway Airlines." Board members, what we're witnessing isn't a typical operational crisis caused by external factors like weather or mechanical problems. I began, my voice steady and professional. The systematic nature of the failures suggests deliberate actions designed to maximize operational disruption and financial damage. Madison shifted uncomfortably in her chair as I displayed a timeline showing the precise sequence of her destructive decisions. Each operational change was documented with timestamps, affected systems, and financial impact calculations. The gate allocation disasters that occurred on day 1 weren't caused by software limitations or training deficiencies. I continued, advancing to the next slide. The scheduling conflicts resulted from deliberately ignoring established protocols that had prevented such problems for over a decade. I watched Brad's expression change as he began to understand the implications of what I was presenting. Madison's mistakes weren't random errors made by an inexperienced but well-intentioned manager. They were calculated attacks on the most critical components of Skyway's operational infrastructure. The fuel calculation errors that nearly resulted in federal safety violations weren't caused by misunderstanding complex procedures. I explained, displaying documentation of Madison's unauthorized system modifications. These changes required detailed knowledge of which safety margins to eliminate and how to circumvent automated warning systems. Board member Robert Torres raised his hand to ask the obvious question. "Alpha, are you suggesting that these operational failures were intentional rather than accidental?" Before I could respond, Madison jumped to her feet, her folder scattering papers across the conference table. "This is ridiculous," she declared, her voice rising with panic. "Alpha is obviously trying to sabotage my reputation because she's angry about being replaced. These were honest mistakes made during a difficult transition period." I remained calm as Madison's outburst confirmed what I had suspected about her psychological state. The pressure from Continental Express executives, combined with the mounting evidence of systematic sabotage, was causing her to abandon the composed facade she had maintained throughout her infiltration. "Madison, I understand your position," I replied diplomatically, "but I think the board deserves to know about your previous employment history and your qualifications for managing airline operations." I advanced to the next slide, which displayed Madison's actual resume alongside the fabricated credentials she had provided to Brad. The real Madison Clark had never worked in aviation, had never completed the claimed MBA from Northwestern University, and had been employed by Continental Express as a junior marketing coordinator until 3 months before beginning her relationship with Brad. The silence in the conference room was deafening as board members absorbed the implications of what they were seeing. Madison's romantic pursuit of Brad hadn't been a coincidental meeting between two people in the aviation industry. It had been a calculated infiltration designed to gain access to Skyway's operational secrets. Furthermore, I continued, advancing to documentation of Madison's unauthorized data access. System logs show extensive copying of confidential route information, passenger demographics, and supplier contracts. This information was transmitted to external email accounts registered to Continental Express executives. Patricia Williams leaned forward, her voice sharp with understanding. Alpha, are you telling us that Madison has been conducting corporate espionage on behalf of our primary competitor? The evidence suggests a coordinated scheme designed to force Skyway into bankruptcy, allowing Continental Express to acquire our routes and assets through distressed sale proceedings, I replied, displaying Continental's debt acquisition records. They've been systematically purchasing our outstanding obligations while simultaneously sabotaging our operations to accelerate financial distress. Madison's composure finally collapsed completely. You can't prove any of this, she shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at me. These are fabricated documents designed to frame me for Alpha's own operational failures. I'm going to sue everyone in this room for defamation and conspiracy. Her threats might have been more intimidating if she hadn't been making them while surrounded by documented evidence of her own criminal behavior. I calmly advanced to the final slide of my presentation, which displayed a single photograph that changed everything. The image showed Madison and Continental Express CEO David Park sharing an intimate dinner at an upscale restaurant, taken just 2 weeks before her hiring at Skyway. The metadata clearly showed the date, time, and location of the photograph, proving their relationship predated her association with Brad by several months. Madison, I think the Federal Bureau of Investigation will be very interested in discussing your relationship with Continental Express executives, I said quietly, reaching for my phone. I've already provided preliminary evidence to federal investigators who specialize in corporate espionage cases. The conference room door opened at that moment, and 2 FBI agents entered wearing the dark suits and serious expressions that immediately commanded everyone's attention. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh displayed her credentials as she addressed the room. Madison Clark, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corporate espionage, and violation of federal computer fraud statutes, Agent Walsh announced, producing handcuffs from her jacket. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As Madison was read her rights and escorted from the conference room, Brad sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the magnitude of his naive mistakes. The woman he had trusted with both his heart and his family's business had systematically betrayed everything he had inherited from his father. Patricia Williams turned to me as the FBI agents departed with their prisoner. Alpha, on behalf of the Board of Directors, I want to offer you the position of Chief Operations Officer with complete autonomy over all operational decisions and the authority to rebuild our systems from the ground up. I looked around the conference room at the faces of people who had watched their airline nearly destroyed by corporate espionage and management incompetence. They needed someone with both the technical expertise to restore operations and the leadership strength to prevent future vulnerabilities. I accept the position, I replied, with the understanding that operational safety and efficiency will take priority over all other considerations, including personal relationships and political pressures. Brad finally found his voice, though it carried the weight of someone who had learned harsh lessons about trust and responsibility. Alpha, I owe you an apology that can never adequately address the damage I've caused. I hope you'll give me the opportunity to learn from this experience and contribute to rebuilding what I helped destroy. Looking at the young man who had inherited more responsibility than he was prepared to handle, I felt a mixture of sympathy and determination. Brad, well, rebuild Skyway Airline stronger than it's ever been. But you're going to learn every aspect of airline operations from the ground up, starting with a junior management position reporting directly to me. The humiliation was visible on his face, but he nodded acceptance of terms that represented his only chance to preserve his family's legacy. Continental Express had failed in their acquisition attempt, but they had succeeded in teaching valuable lessons about vigilance, competence, and the true cost of expertise. As the board meeting concluded and members began discussing immediate recovery priorities, I realized that walking out of this building a week ago had been the beginning of the most important chapter of my career, not the end. 6 months after accepting the Chief Operations Officer position at Skyway Airlines, I stood before the podium at the annual Aviation Excellence Conference in Las Vegas, preparing to address an audience of over 800 industry professionals about operational resilience and crisis management. The transformation of Skyway Airlines from near bankruptcy to industry leadership had become a case study taught in business schools and aviation management programs across the country. The recovery had required complete reconstruction of our operational systems, but it had also provided the opportunity to implement innovations that positioned Skyway decades ahead of our competitors. Working with a handpicked team of aviation professionals who shared my commitment to excellence, we had rebuilt every protocol, every procedure, and every system that Madison's sabotage had damaged. Our first priority had been restoring passenger confidence through absolutely flawless operational performance. For 183 consecutive days, Skyway Airlines had achieved perfect on-time performance with 0 safety incidents, a record unmatched in the regional airline industry. We had implemented predictive maintenance systems that prevented mechanical delays, weather monitoring technology that anticipated disruptions hours in advance, and crew scheduling algorithms that eliminated the fatigue-related errors that plagued our competitors. The financial results exceeded everyone's expectations. Skyway's passenger loads had increased 42% over the previous year. Corporate travel contracts had grown by 68%. And our customer satisfaction ratings led the industry in every measured category. The airline that Continental Express had tried to destroy through sabotage was now capturing market share from Continental's own routes. The legal consequences for Continental Express had been swift and devastating. Federal prosecutors had used the evidence I provided to build a comprehensive case against their executives for corporate espionage, conspiracy, and securities fraud. CEO David Park received a 12-year federal prison sentence, while the company faced over $200 million in fines and restitution payments. Madison's cooperation with federal investigators had earned her a reduced sentence of 4 years in federal prison, but her testimony had provided prosecutors with detailed documentation of Continental's broader pattern of anti-competitive behavior. The Justice Department had launched additional investigations into Continental's practices in other markets, effectively crippling their ability to pursue aggressive expansion strategies. During my conference presentation, I shared the technical innovations that had emerged from our crisis recovery without revealing the corporate espionage details that remained under federal investigation. The audience of aviation professionals listened intently as I described predictive routing algorithms, integrated safety monitoring systems, and crew optimization protocols that had transformed airline operations. The key insight, I explained to the conference audience, is that operational excellence requires both technological sophistication and human expertise working in perfect coordination. You cannot replace institutional knowledge with software, but you can use technology to amplify the capabilities of skilled professionals. After the presentation, I was approached by executives from major airlines who wanted to discuss consulting arrangements and technology licensing agreements. The systems we had developed at Skyway had attracted attention from carriers 50 times our size, creating revenue opportunities that would fund our expansion for decades. But the most meaningful transformation had occurred in our internal culture and leadership development. Brad had spent 6 months working in every department of the airline, learning ground operations, maintenance procedures, crew scheduling, and passenger services from the ground up. His privileged background had initially made him resistant to manual labor and entry-level responsibilities, but the experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of how complex organizations actually function. Brad's evolution from entitled heir to competent manager had been remarkable to witness. He now understood why every protocol existed, why safety procedures couldn't be circumvented for convenience, and why experience was more valuable than enthusiasm. His new position as Assistant Operations Manager required him to demonstrate competency in every area before advancing to additional responsibilities. Alpha. I want to thank you publicly for giving me the opportunity to learn from my mistakes, Brad had said during our quarterly company meeting. 6 months ago, I thought leadership meant making quick decisions based on confidence. Now, I understand that leadership means making informed decisions based on expertise and accepting responsibility for the consequences of those decisions. The company's success had enabled me to establish the Women in Aviation Operations Scholarship Program, providing educational opportunities for young women pursuing careers in airline management, air traffic control, and aircraft maintenance. The program partnered with universities across the country to ensure that future generations of women would have the technical training and industry connections necessary to advance into leadership positions. The scholarship recipients visited Skyway Airlines quarterly for mentorship sessions and operational tours, learning about career paths in aviation while developing the confidence necessary to challenge gender stereotypes in technical fields. Watching these bright young women ask sophisticated questions about flight planning algorithms and crew optimization systems reminded me of my own early enthusiasm for solving complex operational puzzles. The program had already produced remarkable results. 12 scholarship recipients had been offered internship positions at major airlines. 3 had been accepted into graduate programs in aviation management, and 2 had started their own aviation consulting companies, focused on operational efficiency improvements. My personal office overlooked the terminal where passengers boarded aircraft that departed precisely on schedule, their safety protected by systems that had been tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The awards displayed on my walls recognized achievements in operational innovation, safety management, and industry leadership, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that hundreds of thousands of passengers traveled safely every month because of the systems we had built. The experience had taught me that true power comes not from position or connections, but from irreplaceable knowledge and the courage to demand the respect that expertise deserves. For too many years, I had accepted being undervalued and overlooked, assuming that competent work would eventually be recognized and rewarded. Madison's betrayal and Brad's dismissal had forced me to recognize my own worth and fight for the recognition I had earned through 16 years of dedicated service. The crisis that nearly destroyed my career had ultimately elevated it to heights I had never imagined possible. Continental Express' attempt to eliminate me as an obstacle to their acquisition scheme had backfired completely. Instead of removing their primary threat, they had created their most formidable competitor. The expertise they had tried to suppress was now being used to build systems that made their own operations appear primitive by comparison. As I concluded my conference presentation and returned to my seat among the industry leaders who now sought my advice on operational challenges, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The young woman who had started as a junior coordinator, working 18-hour days to prove herself in a male-dominated industry, had become the chief operations officer of the most innovative regional airline in America. The transformation hadn't happened through luck or connections. It had resulted from 16 years of dedicated expertise combined with the courage to stand up for principles, when doing so seemed to risk everything I had worked to achieve. Looking out at the audience of aviation professionals who had listened respectfully to my presentation about operational excellence, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about technology or management systems. It was about the value of persistence, the importance of expertise, and the power that comes from refusing to accept being undervalued. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your expertise was undervalued or dismissed by people who didn't understand the complexity of what you do? How did you handle it? And what advice would you give to others facing similar challenges? Share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to like this story if it resonated with your own professional journey. Subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself in the workplace, and share this with anyone who needs to be reminded of their own worth and capabilities. Thank you for taking this journey with me. And remember that your expertise and dedication are valuable assets that deserve recognition and respect. Keep fighting for the recognition you've earned, and never let anyone convince you that your knowledge and experience don't matter.